As usual, we've got to get to it. A quick prayer, we'll get on it. Again, Father, we thank you for the blessings that you give us. We thank you so much for conveying to us your existence, your presence. We see that through the nature that we are given. We see that through the word that you've also given. And we appreciate it so much. We ask that this class is something that we can remember and hopefully expand upon in the future, and that we are able to use this information in useful ways. We thank you so much in your Son's name. Amen. Okay, I wasn't here last week. I don't know what you guys covered. If you could, one of you volunteer to come up and just do a recap, I would appreciate that. Talked about the flood, okay. So last week, we looked at the timeline of the Genesis flood as seen in Scripture. We noted the account is referenced based to Noah's life, or based on Noah's life. We looked at how the events were likely corresponding to probably creation weeks and how different events occurred with respect to those weeks. We looked at a little bit at the numerology given in the flood account and also in other accounts through Scripture. We then started to look at the geophysical model and the structure of the earth, and finally we introduced plate tectonics as the prevailing theory of geophysics and showed that as plates move around on the earth, we see areas of subduction where crust material is being forced down further into the mantle, and also divergent zones or upwelling zones where plates are basically spreading apart. Now, we're not going to go over this list, but the current commonly accepted theory of plate tectonics generally provide good explanation for a lot of the geophysical and geologic evidences that we see, all the different things that are out there in the world that we can go look at and measure. Many are actually covered by this particular theory. Now, of course, the premise of plate tectonics is that plate movements in the past are really occurring at the same speed we see today. This is more on the common standard model. And of course, that speed is very, very slow. It's about a few centimeters per year. This speed can be measured very accurately, actually, by satellites. And so they have a lot of confirmation about which way the plates are moving, the directions, the speeds, etc. Some of the notable things that are up on that list that I can call out is your earthquake map distribution. A lot of people can get an app on their phone or on their tablet that basically will notify them when different earthquakes occur, and you'll find those around the Ring of Fire. You'll find those in different locations, particularly where the plates are rubbing together. This also explains a lot of the earthquake depths. Those same applications often give you how deep an earthquake is when it occurs. And basically other things. I'm not going to go a lot into this because we've got other things to cover. But overall, the concept of plate tectonics really does give good explanation for much of the evidence that we find. However, this common version of plate tectonic theory can't explain a lot of other things out there. For instance, it seems to occur far too slow, at least for the biblical interpretation. There are particular motion anomalies that happen with the plates that don't quite add up under the common theory. I'd like to point out that diamond formation and certain minerals, which are denoted as high pressure but low temperature minerals, are very difficult for this theory to explain. And the reason for that is because of the actual processes that go about in order to form diamonds. They actually have to be formed in a very hot environment under a lot of pressure. And then over a specific range of time, you have to basically cool them and depressurize them. If you don't do that, you will tend to blow them up. They won't form properly. Or alternatively, if you cool them too slowly, they turn into graphite, something that you would like find in your pencil lead. So there's very specific processes that diamonds are formed under. We know this, of course, because we build them in the laboratories. We build artificial diamonds all of the time, and we know exactly how to do it. And so in nature, we know that nature would have to do it in the same way. So the fact is that slow processes operating over very long periods of time typically cannot produce the results that are seen in nature when it comes to these kind of anomalies that are very difficult to explain. So, not going into much detail there, let's go on and start to think about the Genesis flood and what really we think, or the hypothetical conceptual model would look like. Now, you've heard of Pangea, probably. That's a name that's been thrown around a lot in terms of, a super mega continent in the past. On the screen is some artists' depictions of what that could look like. It's believed basically that all of our current continents used to be connected as one single mega continent. And both in the secular evolutionary theory and also in creation theory, this mega continent is believed to have been broken up, and those pieces migrated to the current configuration, which we're all very familiar with if you look at a globe, where those continents are now. However, of course, the two theories are very different in terms of how and when this happened to occur. I previously showed last week a couple of the scientists that had been working on a model representing the entire Genesis flood. The names I've listed up here again: John Baumgartner, Russell Humphreys, Larry Vardaman, Steve Austin, Andrew Snelling, and Kurt Weiss. These are very familiar names to people who are working within, the creation science type fields. Well, this group of scientists really did start looking at plate tectonics and the issues that they had really back in the late 80s and early 90s. So it's been, probably about 30, going on 40 years now that they've been working on this conceptual model, and we'll find later backing up by computer models as well. But having developed a flood conceptual model, each one contributed different expertises to the model from their own technical areas. I had shown that on the screen. Some were in atmospheric sciences, some were in geophysics, some were in paleontology, and other areas like that. And the model ended up looking very, very similar to one that was really developed much, much earlier, back in 1859 by Anthony Snyder Pellegrini. And he was a scientist that came out of Italy back in that time. But, his book that he wrote regarding this model, with Pangea separating out, moving to the continents to their current location, it wasn't given much, credence at that time. Basically, there was a lot of scientific resistance coming from other parts of the world. He was able to get his book published in France, but that was pretty much about it. And it lay dormant for quite a long time until people meaning scientists, started to accept plate tectonics in general. At that point, all of a sudden, his ideas were starting to be validated. So what does that look like? What is this model that these creation scientists have been looking like? Well, up here is one of the same diagrams I had up on the screen last time. At the time of creation, we expect that really the upper mantle was a lot more rigid and able to support a colder and more dense oceanic crust. Okay, so this lithospheric mantle was in a position so that it was able to support that crust without much movement. You'll see that what's going to happen is the oceanic crust is not going to be an unstable situation. And it seems a little contrary to being called very good for God to have created the world with an unstable system already in place. In other words, the oceanic crust was essentially a ticking time bomb if the lithospheric mantle was not able to support it. Now, we don't know why things might have changed. If God called this very good, you would think that this would be, very suitable for life going forward. But something had to happen, and maybe it was at the fall, maybe it was part of the curse that everything was put under, but something changed leading up to the mantle becoming less dense than the oceanic crust. So that black area up at the top all of a sudden was more dense and heavier. The lithospheric mantle was then less dense, and this is unstable. It's not easy to keep it in one position because the upper part wants to sink into the lower part. So we know at the beginning of the flood, because of the distribution of waters that are on the earth, probably about 70% of the earth's surface had more dense material floating on top of less dense material. Now this can be stable for a while. If you look at the bottom of the diagram up there, you see a razor blade floating on floating on the surface of water, and there's even a little nut on top of that to add some weight. And so it isn't necessarily that something is going to immediately happen, but it's an unstable situation. It's just waiting for something to trigger it. So, well, what triggered it? What really started the flood? The answer is we don't know. Perhaps it was kind of terrestrial in nature. Maybe there was a lot of radioactive heat built up in the mantle region that started to make the mantle less rigid and a little more soft and taffy-like or runny honey-like or something like that. Maybe it's astronomical. Maybe a comet or a meteor came in and hit a big region of the oceanic crust and tipped things in the right direction. Tongue-in-cheek, some of the scientists joke, well, it could have been just God slamming the door of the ark closed, and the reverberation triggered it and started the whole flood process. Or it could have been just God reaching down with his finger and pushing down like the edge of that razor blade, just pushing it, and away we go. But with that, the result of this were three things happened simultaneously. We talked about subduction. We didn't talk much last time about mantle-wide flow. We'll mention that briefly, but there's also upwelling. So subduction is where the upper layer is being pushed down into the lower area. And then upwelling is naturally, as that denser oceanic crust is starting to sink into the mantle, it's starting to drag the plate that it's attached to along with it. And I mentioned, think of the skin of a blanched tomato. As soon as you blanch it, it kind of loosens from the meat of the tomato, and you can just start sliding that stuff across. It doesn't separate, it doesn't leave it, but effectively that outer crust started to move, and there's in places where it started to dip down into the mantle. The sinking crust pushed mantle out of the way as it was starting to go down. Naturally, it's taking up volume. It's starting to plummet down into the mantle towards the core of the earth, and it's going to push the mantle below it out of the way, which of course is the mantle-wide flow, that movement of magma sideways, but it's got to go somewhere, right? So it starts to upwell. And so as this plate is moving across, one side dipping down, it's creating a rift, a crevice on the other side where this upwelling is occurring. And so this extremely hot mantle from below is starting to fill the void, fill the gap. You see that in a lot of the oceanic rifts, right? This is still occurring today. As we get some movement of our plates, it opens up these crevices. Or think about some of the volcano scenes that you have seen where it's not just the volcanic cone that's erupting, but you also see these crevices that are around the volcano and the oozing of the lava out of it. And so that's happening on the other side of the subduction zone, and now you've got this extremely hot mantle boiling up from below. Well, what's on top of that? Generally speaking, it was a lot of very cold ocean water as this stuff was coming up. So, like I mentioned, they conceptually modeled this. They thought through this. What is the scripture telling us? What is our geology telling us? What is our geophysics telling us? What is all the science that we understand about the world telling us? And how would this work? And then they decided, well, let's run this through a computer. And so they run this through a computer program. It's a computer model that they built very early on, where they used what's called finite element analysis. Now, most people don't really care what that means, but basically it's a technique to study very complex systems and how they change over time. You all are very familiar with the results of this, because if you look at any of your weather maps and you see the animation of the clouds coming in and you see the moisture, the rain, all that kind of stuff is actually developed through finite element analysis models by the National Weather Service. Okay, so you see the output of a lot of these things for your daily information. Well, a finite element analysis model breaks up the Earth into basically little tiny boxes, and each box is analyzed to see what energy and what materials and what pressure, what kind of linear and rotation movements are happening, what's flowing in, what's flowing out, and how it's affecting the neighbors, little boxes of neighbors beside it. And basically the state of all the boxes have to be computed for each little period of time. So whatever that period of time is that you want to analyze, 1 hour, 1 day, 1 minute, doesn't really matter, you define that. So after you compute all the little boxes and how they've affected each other, then you go back, increment your time to the next unit, and then you redo the whole thing. And ultimately what that does is it gives you this timeline of how things are changing within each little box, and then from that data you derive the meaning. What does that data actually tell you? Of course, when you get very complex systems, you require a supercomputer. And these guys were always on the forefront of using the fastest supercomputers that they could actually get time on. Modeling 2D, in other words, just a flat map, is pretty straightforward. But these guys were very early in the process of trying to extend this into a 3D model. In other words, it's got a whole sphere, it's got the whole Earth. They wanted more resolution, they wanted tinier boxes. And as they did that, they kept breaking the supercomputers that they were using, and they were only able to assimilate about 60 days of time of the flood, because they always wanted more resolution, they always wanted more detail about that. So even to this day, they don't have the entire year of the model complete with the supercomputer. They only have a shorter period of time, but that's kind of where the interesting stuff happens anyways, is up front. Okay, so what happened? Well, the model predicts that this heavy, dense oceanic crust broke away from the continental crust along those continental margins. And with that, the fault lines started to propagate out, and their model is predicting about 50,000 miles of fault line was actually created, which is really enough to circle the Earth 2 times. The continental margins significantly collapsed, so that you basically had enormous landslides tipping into these troughs that were being created by the subduction process. The faulting moves at the speed of sound. Okay, so in rock, that's probably about 1,300 feet per second or so. Sound, it's about 600 feet per second, or air, it's about 600 feet per second. It was a lot faster through rock. But it literally took about 4 to 5 hours before all of this faulting was complete, as it propagated out across the Earth. So the ocean crust starts sinking into the mantle, And due to frictional heating, in other words, if you start rubbing rocks together, they start to get hot. It caused the mantle underneath, as it's going through it, to essentially get less sticky and more runny. And so the sinking started to increase and to accelerate, and so consequently you started to see these plates move quite quickly. Because of this, enormous earthquakes are generated, and they have very good evidence, correlated evidence with real earthquakes regarding how enormous these earthquakes are. It's thousands of times more powerful than what we've ever experienced. Because these things weren't slippery, slidey things, they started catching on each other as they were going down. You found that plate material, mantle material, crust material started catching on each other. And just like what we saw experience out in the ocean next to Japan, like we saw the experience down in Malaysia, a couple of years before that, as plate material gets caught, it's springy to some extent, and then when the pressure's too much, it releases. And guess what happens when it releases? It pushes all the water that's above it up in one big wave, and so these enormous tsunamis were created. We're not talking like these tsunamis that we saw in Japan and Malaysia, in Indonesia there. We're talking much, much larger, hundreds to maybe even thousands of feet tall. Okay, so. So that is actually the mantle that's kind of below the lithosphere. So it's more taffy-like, where the lithosphere is a little more firm. Okay, there's actually not going in a lot of detail here. There's a point where the crystalline structure of the minerals start to change. The pressure is so high and the temperature is so high that the mineral content starts to change and it becomes less able for things to go through.
So where does this subsurface ocean that they're talking about that's under the crust, and they claim that there's more water in that, multiple times more water under the crust than there is on the surface?
Sure. But I think the crust, which is solid, which is not super hot, because as you get water up to boiling point, you're going to get steam and gases, right? Okay. So that water has to be contained in the cooler crust material. Under the continents, we're talking 100 kilometers deep. Under the oceans, 35 kilometers deep. That's a lot of area to put a lot of water, specifically when you talk about going around the entire Earth.
So is that where water came up and where it describes the fountains of the deep opened up?
Yeah, we'll get to that just a second here. Just a second. Okay. So going to this next slide. So the upwelling of magma, where the plates were being pulled apart, essentially allowed for new, hot, and less dense ocean crust to form. And this is where we get our current ocean seafloors from. They create the mid-ocean ridges. And I know you can't really see what's on those diagrams. If you look at the bottom diagram that isn't to the side, where you see the middle continent, if you see the yellow part right in the middle, that is the Atlantic Ocean forming. So the plates are pulling apart. The Pangea is being torn in pieces, and right in the middle of that is what we now call the Atlantic Ocean. Okay? The model correctly predicted, this is the computer model, correctly predicted the direction of plate movement as compared to reality. In other words, we know kind of the direction based on the geology of where these plates had to go in order to get the continents to where they currently are. It correctly showed Antarctica's motion. It correctly showed South America's motion, which was not linear. It was kind of like a a hook thing. It went over and then up. It correctly showed the fast pace of India and how it slammed into southern Europe. Areas where upwelling was occurring would have intensely heated the oceans, sending geysers into the upper part of the atmosphere or even into outer space. And this is where we think they're thinking that the floodgates of heaven are opened, right? Because what do you have now? You have 50,000 miles of magma sitting underneath the oceanic, or under the ocean waters. And this stuff is probably 2,000 to 3,000 degrees. What is that water going to be doing? It's going to be instantly turning into steam at an explosive rate. It's going to be literally propelling itself away from the upwelling area. And as this thing gets wider and wider, and is very quickly to do that, you have this enormous area of magma that this water is coming in contact with, and it's shooting jets straight up, probably, like I say, into the upper atmosphere, maybe with enough velocity to actually get some of that water up into outer space, later on to, of course, re-enter and come back down. Continents were moving at the rate of a fast walk to even a jogging pace. That is entire continents, the North American continent, moving at the rate that you can walk at a good fast pace. We know India was even moving much quicker than that, literally to the point where you would be jogging to keep up with it. We see that all of the sediment, if we look out at the Grand Canyon and we see all of this sediment, well, where did this sediment come from? Well, the plates were grinding as they were being moved about against each other. They were subducting. They're causing enormous earthquakes, thousands of times more powerful than have ever been recorded. New oceanic crust was explosively cooled as it upwelled into the oceanic water. And if you remember the recent Kilauea eruptions, the lava flowed down the mountainside, flowed out into the ocean, and of course what happened there? It was super hot, and it caused these explosive, gas clouds, steam clouds to come up. If you remember, the authorities said, because the charter boats said, hey, this is something we can make money off, people want to see this, let's just ferry a bunch of people out there so they can watch, the action. And they said, don't do that. Why? Because of VOG. I think everybody remembers that term maybe, but volcanic fog, which is what those steam clouds were all about. Why did the authorities say don't get near that stuff? Because it was filled with microfine crystalline flecks of rock, super sharp. If you breathed it in, it was going to do a lot of damage to your lungs. Probably act a whole lot like asbestos did by getting in there, and your body doesn't know what to do with it. It tries to get it out. Not all of it's going to come out, and you're eventually going to get various sorts of respiratory disease based on that. But if you think about all of this material at the bottom of the ocean being, coming up and this steam immediately being generated, it's going to be dislodging the rocks that are down there that are being cooled super fast, super fine amounts of crystals of rock formations going on, being carried up, being thrown up into the atmosphere. That's where a lot of the sediment had to have come from. The grinding of the continents and the literally the explosive action of these upwelling areas. The tsunamis were intense and ultimately spanned entire continents. In other words, when some of these tsunamis happened, they washed from the east coast of the U.S. to the west coast of the U.S. They have definite proof that some of the material that was in the Appalachian Mountains is in California because it was washed across the entire continent. We know what tsunamis look like. If you remember the pictures of Japan, it was not just a bunch of placid water. It was full of material and debris and of mud. If you've seen some of the mud flows that happen in India due to the monsoon seasons, you see how muddy and icky that is. That too was generating sediment as these tsunamis were happening. And these tsunamis were happening like hourly or even more often than that as these plates were shifting around. Tsunamis were huge, and the safest place for Noah and his family was basically in deep water, because there, when the tsunami waves would come by, they were simply bobbed up and then bobbed down. It was probably like a big roller coaster ride, because it was up and then down. And if there's enough water below you, it's much more gentle than if you're closer to shore where the water piles up underneath. That's when you get the destructive force of these tsunami waves going through. We know that because there were ships out in the ocean when the Japan tsunami happened, and they didn't even know the wave passed by. It was so gentle. We know that the waters prevailed for 150 days before they began to recede, and the how do you read into that is the waters continued to increase. Well, the hot ocean floors continued to heat and expand the ocean waters. If you take a pot, oh my gosh, I am not even going to get close. If you take a pot of water, cold water, put it on your stove and start to heat it, and it's very full, what's going to happen? As it heats up, the water is going to flow over the top. Why? Because the water expands as it heats. So the water that was part of the oceans were being heated by these mid-ocean rifts. And if you do a little bit back of the napkin type math, it would suggest that the oceans would have thermally expanded to be from 70 to 100 feet deeper, even if the average ocean temperature was only raised up to about 100 degrees Fahrenheit. 100 degrees Fahrenheit is basically lukewarm water, okay? So volcanic eruptions and darkening of the skies from ash and dust would have started the planet to cool over time. Solidification of the new ocean floors would have let the oceans start to cool and to contract, starting the decreasing of the water. And even though the Mabul, the enormous storm that really does represent the flood, was over, hot oceans and cooling continents would have started the ice age. And the reason is because we have so much moisture being emitted by the oceans, and with the cooling of the planet due to the volcanic ash, the land masses would start to cool much, much quicker. And so you would get a lot of moisture on there, and once it starts to drop below zero, you start ice accumulation. And once you start ice accumulation, that will continue because, again, ice is white, it's reflective, and it starts to cool planet even more. They feel that the ice age lasted about 100 years compared to the 10,000 or so that the evolutionary theory predicts. But it was actually something that is explainable by the flood of Genesis. Late and also post-flood tectonic plate activity, so late in the flood and also after the flood, continued. It's thought to have formed many of our mountain chains. An entire plate, we know, was forced underneath the western coast of North America. It's still there today, but basically the Cascade and the Rocky Mountains are sitting on top of it. India smashed into southern Europe so hard that 200 to 300 miles of the plate was buried underneath the European continent, which of course raised the Himalayan mountains. And during later times, with the water accumulation and everything, there was a ocean or large lake developed mid North American continent. Eventually that was breached, and from that enormous release of water, we carved out the Grand Canyon. Basically, the earth was very stable for a very long time. So, do we have any proof that this model even makes sense? The fact is, yes. The model predicted 20 years in advance that we should be able to find very cold, dense oceanic crust sitting deep in the mantle, diving straight down to literally the mantle and core boundary. Now, because of the volume, it would take multiple thousands of years for this material to heat up enough to melt into the surrounding mantle and basically disappear. Advances in seismic tomography have confirmed this. If you think of how much better ultrasounds are today than they were way back when it was like you see a little child and they said, oh, look, he's so cute, and you just see a blob. Well, that's what early seismic tomography was about. But like ultrasound technology, seismic tomography technology have also increased and gotten better, and now we've been able to image underneath. And guess what they found? They found cold, dense crust right in the areas that this particular computer model predicted. Conventional plate tectonics cannot explain this, as the difference in temperature would be at least 3,000 Celsius, but with millions of years to subduct, which is what the theory of evolution is telling us, very slowly subduction over a long, long period of time, the cold material would have long ago disappeared because it would have come up to temperature. Now, unfortunately, I don't have any time to present the geological evidence that supports the flood. Some items to consider. There's no erosion between the layers. Those thousands of layers that you see in the Grand Canyon, there should be, if those were exposed for 10,000 years before the next episode to lay down the next layer came along, you should see wind erosion, water erosion, but there's none. They are flat and they are together. There's many instances of folded layers like this. Folded layers are problematic because once sandstone, mudstone sets, it's like concrete. It's very, very brittle. And in order to build up those layers over many millions of years, the rocks there would be already set, hard and brittle. And if you go to actually fold them with enough energy coming from somewhere, what do you have? You have things that crack and break, not form very nice things. It looks like these layers were very soft when they were folded. And then later on, after they were folded, they were hardened. You have entire huge layers of, regions, square miles wide, hundreds of square miles wide, literally being flipped over on its back. And so all of your sedimentary layers are going opposite because this something turned this thing over. We also have fossils that pierce multiple layers of sediment. And if that was happening over millions of years, we wouldn't think that would happen. The trees that you can go over to Colorado and see entire forests where you have the petrified wood going through hundreds of layers of sediment, they're trying to tell you, because it took thousands or millions of years for those sediment layers to be laid down, that those trees all stood for that long without rotting and without changing, such that they could later on petrify and become more or less fossilized in place, piercing through all of those layers. Doesn't make a lot of sense, but if this happened very quickly, where entire forests were buried by multiple layers in less than a year's time, they could easily petrify in place, piercing all of those layers. And then, of course, there's evidences of enormous energies. It would take many more classes to present all of the material on Noah's flood, the flood of Genesis, such as answering questions like, how feasible was the ark? Was there really room for all of the people and the food and the animals? How many animals were on board? How did 8 people take care of all of the work, not only of feeding and watering, but also waste removal? Why was the ark dimension so specific? And how did Noah build the ark in the first place? Clearly, I have more to go. But thank you so much. Been a great 12 weeks. And anyway, if you do have questions, I certainly don't mind answering them.